Hi everyone, this should be a short, straightforward video on the sources, some sources of high barriers to entry. So this applies both in monopoly and in oligopoly, anywhere where there are barriers to entry that cause there to be a smaller number of firms. So one source of a barrier to entry could be economies of scale. So you remember when we were looking at the long run average total cost curve. So if these are costs, right, and this is a level of output, right, to the extent that the long run average total cost curve looks like this, remember that was made up from the bottommost part of various short run average total cost curve. To the extent that it is downward sloping and then perhaps flat, and you have economies of scale, right, everywhere that this is falling. So if you have an industry where there are significant economies of scale and the long run average total cost curve falls for a very long time, such that the minimum efficient scale is quite large, in that case, it may be that a handful of firms, a small number of firms, or even one firm, will meet the needs meet the demand of all the consumers in a particular market, and that if there were multiple firms, they would all be smaller and they would face higher costs. And so a smaller firm would have higher average total costs, and that if one of them gets big enough to drive the cost down to here, that it will essentially drive the others out of business. So I think one example of this might be in small towns. There may only be one grocery store, right? Because you don't find, especially at big full-service, enormous grocery stores like Wegmans or a similar full-service grocery store, it takes a certain amount of business, right, to make it worthwhile to run like a full-service deli and a full-service meat counter and to have the whole variety, the pharmacy and the whole variety of things. In small towns, you're not going to find 2 or 3 of those. In fact, the grocery stores may be smaller overall, but a lot of times you'll just find one, and then maybe there's a few convenience stores or gas stations that also sell milk and eggs and a few basic things. But the minimum efficient scale may be big enough that only 1 or 2 or 3 is necessary. So when you think about building commercial jetliners, enormous jets, passenger jets, the fixed costs involved in building those are huge. The facilities you need, the expertise, the equipment, right? The hangars just to assemble, right, and put that all together and paint them and install all of the electronics, the seats, the HVAC, right? The lighting, the emergency parts. It may be the case that the commercial jetliner market only supports a small number of firms: Boeing, McConnell Douglas, Airbus, probably a few others. So that would be the result of economies of scale. If there are significant economies of scale, you may have just a small number of firms. Second one, this one's really straightforward: ownership or control over a key resource. If one particular company controls a key resource that is necessary to compete in an industry, then that may prevent other people from being there. There was a point in time when Alcoa, the aluminum company of America, as I understand it, controlled most of the sources of aluminum, the bauxite mines, in the world, and therefore they controlled, so other firms couldn't get into the aluminum industry if they didn't have access to bauxite, right, the material that's used to make aluminum. So that would be one example. Another one, and this is sort of a multi-pronged part here, but government-imposed barriers. Sometimes the sources of high barriers to entry come from government regulation or government licensing. So IP law, this is intellectual property law. That includes patents, right, copyrights, trademarks, service marks, right, all those sorts of things. But if a company has a patent on something, the government says no one else can use this unless you give them permission. You can license, the use of this, but for the period of your patent, which might be 20 years, no one else can do this unless you sell them the right to do it. So that's a little monopoly, right? That's created by government. There are also regulations, there are licensing requirements that make it more difficult to get into certain industries. All of those can create barriers to entry that restrict entry and competition in a particular marketplace. And finally, and this is a fun one, network externalities. So a network externality is when the value of something increases with the number of people who use it, right? So value of something increases with the number, that says number of people who use it. It's particularly sloppy today, and I apologize. The value of something increases with the number of people who use it. So sometimes there are competing ways to do something, but there's a value to everybody doing it the same way. So I love this picture. In fact, I have a blow up of it here. This looks like a disaster, right? There are countries where you drive on the right, and there are countries where you drive on the left, and either one of them seems to work well, but everybody in a nation has to be doing it the same way. If they're not doing it the same way, then you have problems. The same with the arrangement of keys on the typewriter, right? The QWERTY keyboard. I'm not sure that's the most efficient arrangement of keys, but it's really valuable if all the different typewriters and keyboards have the keys in the same order. I find it super frustrating, like on the TV when you're trying to search through Hulu or Amazon or something, and the keys are in alphabetical order, the letters are in alphabetical order. If I were used to that, that would be fine. So a network externality is when you have value from everybody doing it the same way. So, for example, prior to streaming, prior to DVDs, there were VHS tapes. You may remember these. At a point in time, there were two competing formats. There was Betamax and there was VHS. And they were both very similar, but they were different format, required different players, right? Different size. Some people say that I'm not an expert on this. Some people say that technically Betamax was a higher quality and was a better product. But consumers don't want to have two players. Places that released movies and shows on VHS or on tape, they didn't want to have to produce it in two formats, and eventually one of them wins out. That's a network externality. So when VHS wins out and everybody uses VHS, Betamax kind of loses. So that could be a barrier to entry. If there is an established way of doing something, that can make it difficult for other people to enter. Eventually there is change, right? At some point, the new technology, in this case DVDs, is so much superior to the old one, the VHS, that there is a change, right? There's a replacement. And then streaming eventually replaces, right, the need for DVDs. But this idea that the more people use it, the more valuable it is, can make it difficult for other people to enter. So, in a nutshell, there are some of the sources of high barriers to entry that can lead to the small number of players in certain markets. So think or at least in these market structures like monopoly or oligopoly. All right, that's it. We'll talk a little bit more about oligopoly in the next video.